would need a microphone because I never have in my life. But I have the distinct privilege of welcoming all of you on behalf of Adams State University and its esteemed President David Civaldi to tonight's event, the featured speaker for our Martin Luther King Week activities. King Week itself is sponsored by the Martin Luther King Week Committee, the Black Student Union, President Megan Smith, the Grizzly Activity Board, the Department of History, Government Philosophy, and the Department of Teacher Education.
Is it possible to use one?
We're especially honored tonight to have as our speaker
I don't want to have to hold
Dr.
it.
Charles M. Payne. Dr. Payne is the Frank B. Hixon Distinguished Service Professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, where he's also an affiliate in the Urban Education Institute. Payne is a native of New Jersey, and he earned his bachelor's degree in African American Studies at Syracuse University, go Orange, and his PhD from Northwestern, which coincidentally is the alma mater of President Civaldi. Thanks for clapping, President Civaldi. Payne has a long and distinguished pedigree for one so young. He's taught at Southern University, Williams College, Northwestern University, and Duke before coming to the University of Chicago. And along the way, he's won many teaching awards. And he's actively engaged in issues related to public education and student achievement, which is perhaps the most noteworthy thing any of us could do. Payne has been a member of the board of the Chicago Algebra Project, the steering committee for the Consortium on Chicago School Research, the Research Advisory Committee for the Chicago Annenberg Project, and the editorial boards of Catalyst, the Sociology of Education, and Educational Researcher. And this is an abridgment of what is a very lengthy resume. He's written many important books, including, so you want to go to Amazon and buy these, I've Got the Light of Freedom, the organizing tradition in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. This particular book, which is where I first learned of Dr. Payne as a scholar, garnered awards from the Southern Regional Council, Choice Magazine, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Gustavus Meyer Center for the Study of Human Rights in North America. It's simply a splendid work. But being a multifaceted individual, he's authored many works on education, including most recently, again, go to Amazon, So Much Reform, So Little Change, a volume that's concerned with what we've learned about the persistence of failure in our urban school districts. Payne's topic tonight is De-mythologizing Martin Luther King and racial progress. So please join with me in welcoming Dr. Charles Payne to Adams State University. Charles?
You want to go at the podium there?
Mhm.
Thank you, sir.
Sure, thank you. While we are setting up, let me say I want to thank Ed for inviting me here. I want to thank him for that very generous introduction. It is not often in these tumultuous times that one meets a scholar as shy and as retiring as Professor Crowther. I've had a hard time getting a word out of him since I got here. But I am very glad to be here, and I'm glad he gave me this chance to reflect on Martin Luther King and his legacy. I'm going to try to make at least 2 points. I want to say something first about his philosophy as I understood it, and particularly about how he understood nonviolence, which I think was misunderstood at the time and is very much misunderstood now. Then I want to say something about how he changed over time. The older King, the mature King, is a very different person. I can put this down now? Is a very different person is a very different person from the younger King, and that's not clearly understood. If by chance, we have a few minutes after I wander through that, I'll say something about how I think the movement should be remembered. We'll see how that goes. But my general theme My general theme is that you can't trust technology, and don't think I'm joking. Is that don't worry. I know this is a loaded phrase. The real king was much more interesting than the process king. The king that we get in contemporary media bears only a glancing relationship, I think, to the actual historical figure, so far as we can make that out. We've turned him into some kind of plaster saint, which I think is a dishonor to his actual memory. Let me say first that I have not always had the highest regard for Dr. King. 1968, the year he was killed, I was at Syracuse University. I was a junior. I was a part of a group of socially active young people. We were arranging demonstrations and the like all the time. We were community organizers, youth organizers. We did anti-war work. We were interested in black power. We thought of ourselves as movement people. Not a single one of us that I can remember was particularly interested in Martin Luther King, right? We thought of him as square, as uninteresting, too quick to compromise, right? We had an issue with a kind of coziness between him and the Kennedy administration, right? And again, it wasn't that we had anything in particular against him. It was sort of like your well-intentioned uncle, right? Well-intentioned, but just not with it, right? Behind the times, right? So that, I think, for a lot of young black people in 1966, 67, 68, that is how we thought of Dr. King, right? And then there were others who had a deeper, more complex kind of critique of him. Nevertheless, when Dr. King is killed that April, I immediately became angry, and angry at white people in general. And for reasons that I cannot explain to you to this day, I became particularly angry at all the white people who were walking up to me apologizing for Dr. King's death. I mean, I don't know why, it just set something off in me, right? So the students I teach today honor Dr. King as a great man, but there's something shallow about the way in which they honor him. It's been a long, long time since I have taught a student who's actually read anything by Dr. King, since I have taught a student who knows very much about Dr. King other than that one speech, I Have a Dream. They don't see him as having produced ideas that are worth struggling with, right? They don't find him an interesting thinker. Part of that, I think, for me in the past, and for a lot of my students now, is that he is so closely associated with this idea of nonviolence. So for me, when I am with the age of most of you in the audience, the whole notion of nonviolence was a non-starter. It was not even something that we could talk about or thought worth talking about. It was unmanly, it was embarrassing. The idea that somebody was going to hit you and you don't hit them back, if anything, that would have struck most of the folk I knew as just a little bit crazy, right? Well, my understanding from nonviolence is pretty much picked up through the media, and that notion that nonviolence can be equated with refraining from physical violence is something that was translated from the media. That was a bad translation. You know, Gandhi's general term for his philosophy is satyagraha, and a better translation of it is the power of human truth power, the power of the human soul, right? And the best way to think about the general principle at the center of satyagraha is that whatever situations you are confronted with in life, you should confront those situations with the best aspect of yourself. An example of that might be being confronted with violence and responding with nonviolence. But it is an example, it is not the general principle. And what happens when the idea is translated across cultures is that that more complicated idea gets reduced to the idea that the real problem is physical violence. Gandhi spoke against that idea innumerable times. He always said that verbal violence, what you say about people that injures their dignity, will hurt them long after they've forgotten about physical violence, right? Spiritual violence, what you say about people that is evil, will injure not only that person, but will injure you. And that may be the worst kind of violence in his hierarchy. One of the obvious implications of that Dr. King harped on a lot is that it is wrong to think evil of your opponents. There is no such thing as a personal enemy. The enemy is always a system of oppression. How many of you remember Bull Connor? Okay, you're going to be hearing that name a lot, and this is the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham demonstrations, where Bull Connor, a violent, hate-filled man, right? The people he beat down, the pregnant women that were beaten in his prison, the young kids who had dogs sicked on them. He is a violent and hate-filled man, right? He is the movement's great antagonist in that city. Well, there comes a point when Dr. King finds out somehow that Bull Connor's wedding anniversary is coming off. And Dr. King asked the demonstrators to stop demonstrating for a day so that Bull Connor can spend that day with his wife, right? Now again, they are locked into a titanic struggle, right? What's going to be a transformative struggle, but at some point Dr. King could still recognize that this man who behaves in such an evil way is in fact a human being, right? And we can back off and treat him like that. How many of you recognize the name Medgar Evers? Ooh, that's impressive. Impressive and pleasing, because that's a name that's been forgotten in too many places. Like a lot of the early civil rights activists, he is a World War II veteran. I have to think about this. I don't know that any of the World War II veterans, and there were a great many of them in the first wave of movement leaders in the Deep South, I don't know that any of them believed in nonviolence as a way of life. Nearly all of them were armed all the time. Medgar Evers became secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi in 1954. It was widely assumed that that was a death sentence for him. He was put on the Klan's death list that first year. It was 9 years before he was killed, which amazed a lot of people. Medgar Evers went almost no place unarmed. No place unarmed. He always had a rifle in the trunk of his car, and he often had a pistol on his person, right? Nevertheless, when people called his home, threatening to kill not just him, but to kill his wife and to kill his children, he tried to engage them in conversation. He was trying to find some kind of common ground with people who were threatening his own loved ones. Now, would you call him nonviolent? I mean, I just said he carried a gun every place. He tried to let everybody in Mississippi know he was going to defend himself if he had to defend himself. And yet, the vilest racist, he thought, potentially had something in common with him, and that if he talked to them long enough, and sometimes it almost worked out this way, right? He was actually able to engage people in conversations when they had called to threaten him. In the Gandhian sense, he is nonviolent because he recognizes his opponents as not fundamentally different, not morally different from himself. There's a young woman named Annelle Ponder. She was on Dr. King's staff. She was working voter registration in Mississippi. She got arrested along with Fannie Lou Hamer, the other one of the great Mississippi heroes of the movement. It was literally, they got arrested for driving a school bus that had too much yellow in it, right? That was and the cops beat them daggone near to death, right? The cops beat them until they themselves were tired with a leather strap. And they beat them, then they got prisoners, and they had the prisoners beat them with that leather strap until they were tired. When they were let out, their eyes were swollen, they could barely stand, someone had to help them to the microphone. When one of the reporters asked Annelle Ponder what did she think about the people who had beaten her this way, her answer was that, well, this is what happens when people allow themselves to be separated from God, right? After what she had just gone through, she could still recognize them as potentially a part of the same moral community of which she was a part. She could still retain respect for their potential, even though what they had done to her was utterly despicable. She did not have any sense that God loved her any more than God loved them, right? A friend of Dr. King, Vincent Harding, because some of you in this audience might know him, says that for Dr. King, the essential thing about nonviolence was that it was a spirit that engaged people. That was much more important than this notion of did you shoot back, did you hit back, right? So there was one group of the kids in the center, the kids in the sit-in said it this way: Violence corrupts and destroys both the user and the victim. The power of love and nonviolence is creative and redeems both. That is a much smarter way of thinking about it. You know, I'm a teacher. I teach students who tend to be very socially active, very socially conscious. That stance toward nonviolence is much more sophisticated than what I see among most of the young activist groups, where too often the way in which the activists talk about one another could be called a kind of dialogue of contempt, not just for the people they are fighting against, but even for people on their side who happen to disagree with them about something. And so that everybody who is not completely lined up with you is a Tom, a sellout, is bourgeois. You know, those would be that's the language that you would hear in the black community. Could not prove it, but I am fairly certain that that predisposition to think in the most negative terms that we can is sometimes especially strong among members of minority groups, right? That they turn on one another with these low expectations that they put on one another, and we can be certain that what that does is dumb down the discourse. If you think about, I've lost the quote, but Charlie Cobb, who was one of the great activists in the voter registration movement in Mississippi, said that every struggle against tyranny and oppression in Mississippi was preceded by a more profound struggle against our own individual weaknesses, right? If you think about nonviolence in its more expansive way, in a more appropriate way, it can become a tool with which we examine our own moral integrity. And that might be the first step to a healthy movement, to a healthier movement than some of the ones we've had. So that's what I wanted to say about King and nonviolence and how the idea has been distorted. I want to say something else about how the image of Martin Luther King has been frozen in time. He had about 14 years of public life, right? Which is not very long, right? Just 14 years of public life from Montgomery to Memphis. And people tend to freeze him. It is always, in the historical mind of, collective mind of America, it is always August 28, 1963, and King is calling the peaceful throngs together at the March on Washington, right? Let me just say, and I understand that this may strike a few of you as sacrilegious, I'll be quite happy if I never have to hear that speech one more time in life, right? I think it's pretty much vacuous. There's no political analysis, there's no political prescription. There is no sense in that speech that change is going to cost somebody something, right? It's a series of open-ended metaphors into which anybody can read anything they want, right? Now, again, I understand. It was a certain kind of occasion. It was a consensus-building occasion. And footnote, at the moment it happened, most Americans were against the march. So you needed to build some consensus. So it was a perfect speech for the occasion. But to tell you anything about where the movement was at that moment, nah, that speech will not do it. Now, footnote, having said all of that, let me also say that the FBI didn't like the speech. The FBI said it was full of lies and demagoguery. And so that gives me a little pause, because anything the FBI didn't like must have something going for it, right? Anyway, that speech was 1963. The speeches later in his life, almost all of them, frankly, for me, say more, right? My sense of his personal development is that he starts off as a young Southern Baptist preacher, and he's pretty full of himself, right? He comes from an extremely privileged family. Mrs. Hamer said that when she first met Dr. King, you could be in a room talking to him by yourself, but he spoke as if he was speaking to an audience of thousands, right? He was pretty self-centered. That's the young Martin Luther King. But life has a way of teaching all of us, right? The older he got, the more thoughtful he became, the more complicated, the deeper his thinking, the deeper his analysis of American society. And one of the things that meant is that while the young Dr. King thought he was going to do something to stop individual prejudice, the older Dr. King thought the real problem was structural inequality. For example, he said, 1968, "If we look honestly at the realities of our national life, it is clear that we are not marching forward. We are groping and stumbling. We are divided and confused. Our moral values and our spiritual confidence sink, even as our material wealth ascends. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its interrelated flaws of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are deeply rooted in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be phrased." Now notice the emphasis on militarism and materialism. That would not have been there 5 years ago. He was not focused on that. Those were things that he had gone into. It's not at all surprising that the last campaign of his life was a campaign to eradicate poverty in this country. The Poor People's Movement was not going to be a 1963 style appeal to moral conscience. He wasn't clear anymore that you could make additional change that way. It was intended to be a disruptive direct action movement. It was going to be a rainbow coalition of the poor that went to Washington arguing for a guaranteed minimum wage and better health care. And they were going to occupy key places in Washington until the government decided to move. Many of the largest contingents came from the West. From Colorado, Jorge Gonzalez led a group that issued a plan for the barrio, demanding better housing, better education, and the restitution of Pueblo lands. From New Mexico, Reyes Teorina, whose home had just been bombed almost immediately before the march, led a large contingent. Dr. King, of course, was in Memphis planning the Poor People's Campaign when he was killed himself. Before he was killed, though, he was again roundly criticized for the whole idea of turning the civil rights movement into an anti-poverty movement. He was told that he was overstepping his bounds, he was irresponsible. We'll come back to that. For me, perhaps the single greatest moment is not so much his civil rights moment, it's what he did by way of speaking out on Vietnam. Because this was a tortuous decision for him. It's a decision that took him over a year to make. The Vietnam War was still widely popular in this country. With a single exception, every advisor he had warned him against speaking out against the war, told him he would lose financial support, which turned out to be true. He would lose political friends. He would hurt the movement, right? And he wrestled with it. He went into depression over it, right? Over whether or not he could morally remain silent. And then April 4th, 1967, exactly a year before his death, he goes to Riverside Church in New York, and he gives that speech Beyond Vietnam. Now at this point, I was supposed to be able to do something, and you were going to hear his voice delivering part of that speech. I just messed up the technology. It is not my strong suit. I've already told you that. I can't even make the microphone work, right? So you're going to have to settle for me reading a bit of this speech. I'd much rather you hear his voice, obviously. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people? It became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. At the time he spoke, I would guess that the black and Latino soldiers accounted for 25%, somewhere between 20 and 25% of the casualties coming back from Vietnam. We are taking black young men who have been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. We have repeatedly been faced with a cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation. Surely this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor in America who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and dealt death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as one who loves America to the leaders of our own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. Now, let me give you guys who may have political aspirations. Now, by the way, you don't hear that speech nearly as much as you do the other speech, okay? It made powerful people uncomfortable then. It makes powerful people uncomfortable now. But let me give those of you with political aspirations some advice. If you ever want to be invited to the White House, you don't tell the President of the United States that he is a liar and a hypocrite. You don't call the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, which is a phrase from earlier in that same speech. For the last 2 years of his life, he did not set foot inside the White House, which tells you about how Johnson felt about King's growing involvement in the anti-war movement. The national press, which makes him such a hero now, ate him up. New York Times. To divert the energies of the civil rights movement to the Vietnam issue is both wasteful and self-defeating. Washington Post. He has diminished his usefulness to his cause, to his country, and to his people. Chicago Tribune warned Negroes that if they wanted to continue to make progress, just how patronizing is that whole phrase, right? If they wanted to continue to make progress, quote, they had better get responsible leadership and repudiate the Kings and the Carmichaels. Carmichael being Stokely Carmichael, then of the Black Power movement, right? The tone of those remarks is pretty much the tone of press coverage of King in the last year of his life. They were just beating up on him, right? There's great irony in that his contemporary image has come to be dominated and controlled by the various social forces he spent his life fighting. One of his biographers writes of him, in death, King became a symbol of national unity, a moderate reformer from the South, a foe of irresponsible militants, a deeply American figure whose achievements testified to the resilience of American democracy, the uncompromising opponent of the Vietnam War, the harsh judge of American racism, the scathing critic of free enterprise, the militant advocate of poor people's power, had to be quickly forgotten. Joseph Lowery, one of King's colleagues, said the same thing more briefly. We've put Martin on this rotunda of irrelevant adulation and removed him from the struggle for economic justice. Somewhere along the line, we managed to resurrect the messenger and bury the message, right? Along those lines, last week I got a call, I'll say this and stop. Last week I got a call from a reporter. It was a young reporter from a college paper. And she wanted to know what I thought Dr. King would think about the current situation. And because it was a student, because it was a young person, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know I made a polite response. Because if it had been an older reporter, I might have made a more annoyed kind of response, right? People just should know some things. If you know that King spent the last years of his life railing against the big four, poverty, racism, militarism, and materialism, then at least some things should be clear about how he would look at the current situation, right? If you know that the chances of a low-income child in this country graduating from college have gone from 5% in his day to only 9% in our time, a 4% improvement, right? Over a 40-year period. And that's compared to 54% chance for children from well-to-do families. If you know that since 1979, the wages of the bottom 90% of the income distribution have increased by 15%, while the wages of the top 1% have increased by 134%. If you know that college students are graduating with debts in the six figures, if you know that black unemployment is twice white unemployment, which is exactly what it was in April 1968, if you know, in short, that this is economically a much more unequal society than the one he left us, you should have some hint, at least, of how Dr. King would think about the current scene. And obviously, I know there would be another side. I mean, and he would be pleased and maybe stunned by the whole Barack Obama phenomena. On the other hand, again, in his latter years, he understands inequality in structural terms. So he would not have expected that changing an individual in a place in and of itself changes the issues that he's most concerned with. On the other hand, I think what would have warmed his heart, right, would have been the way in which Obama won re-election a couple of months ago. 71% of the Asian American vote, 73% of the Hispanic vote, substantial support from women and gays. Did everybody see the poll yesterday which says that 62% of Americans now are in favor of a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants, right? That's a 12% improvement in about a year and a half, right? I think he would look at that and see the possibility of excluded and marginalized groups coming together to make a more inclusive America. And I think he would feel that his life is vindicated, that the America that he thought was possible is in fact still possible. This is the America he had in mind when he wrote, "If we will only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." So I think I will close with that, and we can have some questions now. Is that right? Good. Okay. So, thank you. Thank you. So, questions, comments? Everybody stop looking at Ed. He said it's okay. And I'm happy, the lights are so strong, I can't see you. So if you're waving or something and I don't see you, just stand up. I'm so surprised.
I know. So the I Have a Dream speech is the rhetorical monument. What are your comments on the physical monument on Washington Mall? What does it do well? What does it not do at all? What's your critique of it?
I haven't seen it, so I'm reluctant to say. The only concern that I have about that kind of iconization, is that there is always a danger in thinking that a complex social movement can be reduced to an individual. He is a great spokesperson for the movement, right? There are some moments in which he's strategically important. It's really not that many, right? But what you have to understand about the movement is that there are tens of thousands of people, most of whom you have never heard of, many of whom are doing things that are dull, repetitive, unimportant, undramatic, who create the stage, right? And then Martin stepped out on that stage. And once he's on that stage, he plays the hell out of that role, right? But Martin didn't create that stage, right? That's a whole lot of folk who came before. So, again, I mean, the whole, that kind of physical iconization, so long as it's kept in that perspective, I'm pretty comfortable with it. Anyone else? Sure.
I think that things I've heard about him being a human being and having failings, but having the ideas that he had to, get the American public to see the error of their ways and to make the kind of great changes that he helped lead. I think we can overlook the fact that he was a human being with failings, taking 2 years to struggle with the ideas of the errors of Vietnam?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. When I think about, I'm very excited because this spring I get to teach a course on the civil rights movement, which I haven't been able to do in 5 years. So, you know, I'm getting my head back into what is it I want the kids to learn. One of them, and this in a way goes back to Ed's question, I don't want them to think that and this is, for me, it's a special problem with Black and Latino youth. They think that the generation of the 60s were some other kind of people, that they were giants then, right? They had unity then, they were effective then, right? And we can't do that now, we just fuss and fight among ourselves, right? I want them to understand that the exact same faults they have now, they had then, right? I used to love to bring civil rights activists to my class so that people could see they had egos, that there were things they didn't understand, there were things they got wrong. They're just like anybody else, except they're able to rise up at a moment in their lives and do something that transforms the country for all of us. And that's the way I want people to think about the movement. It is not made by great people. It is made by very ordinary people who collectively, under a certain set of historical circumstances, do some very extraordinary things. Right? But they are not. And so the idea of King's failings, the idea that he may have been running around, the idea that he had an ego, all of that makes it more important for me, right? That he is still able to struggle with the negatives inside himself to bring out the positives that he did. And if he has that potential, then we have that potential. And so I couldn't agree with you more. Please, 1, 2.
Considering that, what you said was that the low-income kids or children have a hard time getting to colleges or connections or resources, so not really doing that much. What can we do as citizens to promote that change?
Well, you know, the whole range of ways to think about that. You know, other countries, let me go way to the deep end, then I'll come back to reality. You know, there are places in Finland, where you get as much education as you want and you qualify for it. And so if that's through a graduate degree, then that's what the government pays for. Now, it's a smaller country, it's a different kind of economy. But I wish we would open up our heads and at least be willing to think about, we are in a much more competitive world situation, right? China has announced over the last couple of years enormous investments in human capital, right? I don't know that it's about altruism anymore. We have to make higher education available. This is admissions week at my school, so I'm reading admissions folders. And kids have to tell us when they come into graduate school, how much debt they have. We have kids coming into graduate school to be social workers who already have like $200,000 in debt. Right? I mean, yeah, it's past great. At the other end, I mean, I think there are the smaller scale issues, the restrictions in the Pell Grants. We need to go back to where we were. So there's a whole range of things, but I think we should think seriously about investing in our youth, right? And I think we should look carefully at the data, which I suspect will apply, that those investments will pay off down the road. Who was the second question? And the row behind you.
Speaking of Martin Payne as a nonviolent activist,
Which segment is a non-what? Non-fighting?
Non-violent.
Oh, non-violent, sorry. My fault.
Sorry, as a non-violent activist, did he branch out frequently to like the Black Panthers or to Malcolm X? I know that in history it kind of teaches that wasn't agreeable with them, but at any point in time did he ever?
Yes and no.
You repeat the question?
Well, what I heard was a question about Martin's relationship to the Black Power movement, right, to the Black Panthers and the others. And it's complicated. I actually skipped a part of my speech just because I was worried about time, where I said one of the other things I admire about him in is that when black power is articulated in 1966, it was talked about before that, but it becomes public knowledge in 1966, it becomes public discussion. Martin, as a centrist, right, is put under all kinds of establishment pressure to disavow the young kids talking about black power, right? And he never, ever did it, right? And he would tell them, listen, white people are your allies, don't talk about them like they're not human. I mean, he would chastise them, much of that in private, but in public he would say, these are young people, they're going to experiment with ideas. And there's nothing wrong with black people having this power. He tried to give them more of a colony. That took nerve again, right? The NAACP did exactly the opposite. The NAACP just came down the whole idea of black power. They'll deny it now, but the records are real clear, right? That a lot of the other leaders in the middle of the movement were frightened. He always maintained strong personal relationships with the left wing of the movement, right? When after the young kids sit-ins at one time, when it's black power, a part of his gift as a leader was his capacity to keep talking to every wing of the movement, even when the wings of the movement were not talking to each other, right? He really did that extremely. There's another hand behind. Please.
Do you see similarities of Martin Luther King and President Obama?
I should have anticipated that. Yeah.
Struggle, but President Obama's in a position as a man of color to do more than Martin Luther King done, and that's a lot of the progress and the work that Martin Luther King
accomplished to eventually get to this point?
The critique of Dr. King that bothers me most is that he left the people who had no way of fighting but following. I'm not saying that's that I accept that to be literally true. What I am saying that as compared to the left wing of the movement, where the emphasis is always you develop leadership among the people you're working with, right? Because they shouldn't depend on you. They need to be their own leaders. Ella Baker, Bob Moses, Macon, Mississippi. Dr. King, SCLC, they were into being leaders, not developing leaders. And there are advantages either way. I think movements need both kinds of leadership. But when King is gone, SCLC is not a real organization. It can't do anything, right? Without that charismatic personality. He did not spend enough time building a base, okay? And he knew he was going to be killed. There wasn't much question about that. So, Obama, I don't know if he has learned the lesson, but clearly after the first election, he stopped building his base, right? He did not keep up the lines of communication to the black community. College students were so excited about him in 2008. He doggone didn't start talking to them again until 2011, right? All of that infrastructure that got created for the 2008 election, largely with it, right? So listen, I worked for him in this election, and I want you to know where I am, right? But it worries me that neither one of them did enough to build a base. In the same way the young people in that period thought that Dr. King was too centrist, for my taste, there have been times, fairly numerous times, when Mr. Obama has been too much concerned with compromise. And again, I understand we have to have compromise. I'm not against that, right? But sometimes it just seems to be a bit too far. That's a good and it's a complicated question.
I think my generation is probably the most self-centered so far. And I'm wondering how would you unite them against poverty, racism, militarism, and serious?
Here's your homework. What's Stokely Carmichael's biography, autobiography? Ready for Revolution, is that the title? Find Stokely's autobiography. Read Stokely's description of what the Howard University campus was like on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement. And what are you going to say? These some bourgeois Negroes. Right? They don't care about anything except the whole Greek thing. They're not really black. They're much more Greek than they are black. They care about their clothes. They care about the car. They care about moving out together. These are some empty-headed Negroes here at Howard University. Right? And you can imagine how Stokely will say that. But you look at the new election, hands on the freedom bomb, which was a great, the best thing that came out in the last few years. Women from slavery. Right? And to be honest, women are just more honest. Right? But look at the way in which they characterize the campuses that they were on. Again, a part of our misrepresentation of the 60s is that we think the strongest were the Arabs. They were not. All right? Now, very often, SNCC had its power. SNCC, when they had Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson walking up and down, cursing them, right? SNCC was about 300 people. There were 300 very serious people. Right? It was not, and all have stories about how they had to duck and dodge and manipulate those students on their campus to create the appearance of a mass movement. And then what would happen is that sometimes all the guys you got to come to the demonstration only because the cheerleaders were there. They weren't going to anything political. Once they got there, they got politicized. All right, so I'm saying first you are dramatically exaggerating the differences among generations. All right? The difference that worries me is that in that generation you had more bridges into activism. You had the English youth clubs, right? You had more community organization. I don't know where young people who are so bent and so inclined go to connect to people who are already doing the work, right? And a lot of people in SNCC and CORE would blame themselves for letting those structures atrophy, for not teaching the next generation. So, and on the issue of I think I'm quoting misquoting Charles Sherrod, who led the movement in Albany, Georgia. Don't think you can figure this thing out in advance. Right? The movement is not made by people who have plans and execute plans. The movement is made by people who do something, right? And you guys did this players, you know, the call, do something was wrong. Who did something, and then in the process of doing something, they learned enough to make further plans. But it is not that anybody sat down in 1960 and said, here's what direct action is going to look like in 1963. No one did that. And so, what your generation has to do is forget about that generation in some ways, right? Because it's intimidating, right? The great advantage that they had in 1960 is that they weren't looking over their shoulder at another generation trying to live up to that generation. Because that is the story. You have to find out what you can do. It's not going to be dramatic. It's not going to be worth changing. I would drive around all the faculty members this afternoon and drive through some really low-income Latino whole towns, right? I mean, dominated by Latino population. And boy, the kinds of work that can be done right here on your doorstep with those populations, right? The kind of work that you can do among yourselves, just in creating healthy relationships among yourselves, which will then put you in business. You cannot think in terms of pulling down the barricades all at once. That is not going to happen, right? But you can think. You don't have to be Ron Luther King. You can be Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson and Edie Nixon. And they're the people who made it possible, right? But you can build the infrastructure. And that's, don't be intimidated by that generation. There's no more potential in them than there is in you. Anyone else want to preach that? Go ahead.
How do you motivate people that do not have backgrounds in childhood of knowing about Black history? How do you motivate them to want to learn more about Black history?
Let me answer another question because I can't answer that. We don't have enough teaching of the movement or enough teaching of Black history going on. Right? And so one of the things that's utterly clear of all the stuff that I teach, it's the movement courses that my students remember when they're 10 or 20 years old. And that's white students and Black students. They remember it in different ways. They all get a sense from studying the movement to the 60s that they can be historical actors. Right? What's different about Black students is that studying the movement changes their attitude toward their grandparents. That's literally what they said. Right? that they're more respectful about the black guys when they understand how other movement is. So I'm going to say that the first problem is not the people who are resistant, but the first problem is that so little of that is being taught in an effective way, and when it is being taught, it's being homogenized and processed and dumbed down. Right? So just getting it taught is the first problem. The other part of it, how do you find the reluctant? How do you reach the reluctant? I mean, if you're talking about college-age populations, then, I mean, for me, I've been a chair of 2 African-American studies departments, and part of what we had to do was destroy, I mean what I say, we had to destroy among black students the idea that black studies was an inferior attitude. I say white students, right? Black students have issues with this thing, right? And they come expecting certain kinds of things. And so we just deliberately said, our courses are going to be as hard as organic, right? As hard, and then you get a certain kind of reputation. And then the best students will come to you, the best students looking for a challenge, black or white. And when they come, other folks start coming because it gets a certain kind of cachet, right? That the African American Studies courses have a certain kind of. So that's not a general answer. I think the general answer is you have to trick people into taking it. And then once you trick people into taking it, a fair large number of them will be hooked on it. Right? That's the understanding. That's an organizer's response. If not, then let me see if I can end this by making one comment about how I would like, I'm speaking specifically in a particular kind of way. Let's say to young people, I think Mrs. Hamer, this is a Faneuil Hamer story I'm going to try to tell. Let's see if I can do this right. Mrs. Hamer, of course, as I was saying, she's the heart and the soul of the movement in Mississippi. She says that once upon a time, there was a man who was accounted wise, and he was supposed to be so wise that he could answer any question that you posed to him, right? Well, they were a group of young people, and you know how young people are, they always want to be causing trouble. So they said this, that man's supposed to be so smart, he's not so smart, and we can prove he's not so smart. We can ask him a question that he cannot possibly answer correctly. So what we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to capture a little bird. And we're going to hold the bird in our hand like this. And we're going to go to that old man and we're going to say, old man, this that is in our hands, is it dead or is it alive? Right? If he says it's dead, we open our hands and the living bird flies out. If he says it's alive, we crush our hands and we show him a dead bird. We got the old man coming and going, right? So they capture a bird, they go to the old man, and they come and they say, old man, this that is in our hands, is it dead or is it alive? But the old man really was as wise as he was supposed to be, and all he would say is, it's in your hands. And that is exactly, I am sure, how Faneuil Hamer would like you to think about the movement that she and Dr. King shared. I'll leave you with that, and thank you very much for your questions. Thank you. That's very kind.